Hi there, my name is Justin Hibbert. I'm the host of the Why Catholic podcast. And one of the questions that I often get is, Justin, you were a Baptist pastor for a number of years and eventually became Catholic in Utah, nonetheless. How did that happen? And my first response is, how much time do you have? In reality, if you want to read a long version, I have my memoir, Pilgrimage to Catholicism.substack.com, where you can read it for free, or you can watch my hour-long interview on the show, The Journey Home. But today I want to give you my conversion story in a nutshell. And I want to preface it by saying that philosophers for centuries have tried to understand what are the transcendentals. In other words, what are the elements that all of us seek, all of us human beings are looking for, despite our religion, where we grew up, our culture, our economic status, and so forth. And over the years, there's been this kind of consensus, particularly in the Catholic and from the Catholic philosophers, who said we are all looking for three things: truth, goodness, and beauty. These are the transcendentals of human nature. And that is, I think, something you will find in all convert stories, that there is a search for truth, goodness, and or beauty. And it's certainly the case with my conversion story. So I would say that my conversion story began when I left ministry. I was looking for a church as I began looking for churches, and I began to be frustrated because I felt like there was something missing from a church. And I didn't even understand at the time that I felt like something was missing at the church, but there was an itch that I could not scratch. And it just became more and more prevalent that I felt there was something fundamental missing from a church, from churches. And that was amplified when COVID really broke out in the spring of 2020. And pastors were scrambling to stay relevant. And so they were taking the cameras and pointing them on themselves and pointing it on their guitar player and saying, hey, join us for church in your living room. And I'm like, this is not church. And it's exposing that I realized that there is something fundamental missing from church. And I still could not articulate what it was. Now, during COVID, our family made a difficult choice, and that was to take a break from attending a church. The evangelical church we were attending, we didn't feel were taking proper precautions, and that was our particular problem because my wife at the time was an ER nurse, and we knew that at any moment she could be exposed and have this illness, and she could be giving it to other people, and we certainly didn't want her as a frontline worker saving lives being exposed unnecessarily to this illness. And so we decided to take a step back from attending church, and that gave me the time and the space to explore these questions that I had about what is church supposed to be. And at the same time, you had people losing their jobs because of COVID. And I thought, is there a church out there that's really doing, that's really sacrificing its finances to provide for these families in need? Or is it all about just keeping the lights on at the church and paying the pastor's salary? And then a couple of months after COVID, you had the race riots that began with George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. And I was perturbed by many of the overt and underlying racist comments I was seeing from some of the evangelicals in my circles. And I thought, this is exposing another problem that I see in churches, and that is churches are by and large homogenous. I go to a church and it looks predominantly like me, white, middle class. And how are we supposed to learn about the marginalized if our churches just look like us? How are we supposed to learn about the other if they just look like us? Martin Luther King Jr. famously said some 50 years ago that 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. I'm not sure much has changed. All of these things led me to begin asking questions. At the same time, I was reading a great book, a book called Church History by the 4th century Bishop Eusebius. And I began learning about all of these things about the ancient church from the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries that I didn't know. And I began to ask these questions about church, or began wondering what a church would look like if it really put Jesus at the center. And instead of, the pastor and sermon in the camera at the center, or a church that was multicultural, a church that was sacrificing financially to provide for those in need, a church that was bigger than just its four walls, a church that had other cultures and other churches speaking into it, a church that was connecting the present with the past. These were the things I was looking for in a church. And finally, I scratched my head and I said, am I looking for the Catholic Church? You see, that was a problem because as a lifelong Protestant, everything I knew about Catholicism, for the most part, came from Protestants. And I had a very Protestant bias when I looked at Catholicism, and sometimes, and in some cases, an anti-Catholic bias. And that led me to a search for truth, where I said, if I want to learn about Catholicism, and I really want to give this an honest shake, I need to learn about Catholicism from Catholics and need to hear their terminology and need to hear their perspective, not Protestants telling me what Catholics believe. And what I quickly realized was that pretty much everything I had learned about Catholicism from Protestants were either half-truths, caricatures, or just downright lies. And what I discovered was that Catholicism was an amazingly complex faith that was interweaved with Scripture. You know, all the times that Protestants said, well, Catholics believe this, but that's not found in the Bible. Well, that's not true. It is biblical. But the doctrines developed in much more articulate ways outside of Scripture. And so I began saying, wow, this is breathtaking. Now, I got to a point where I'd listened to all these podcasts and watched these videos and read these books, and I said, you know, something's missing here, and that is that to learn more, I really have to experience it. And I really need to attend Mass. And when I attended Mass, I found something else. It's the breathtaking beauty of Catholicism. It's not in the music, it's not in the homily, it's not in the building. It's in the center focus of the Mass, and that is the Eucharist. The Eucharist, what we believe about the Eucharist is that the bread and wine are they're not merely symbolic, they're not merely symbols, but that there's something mysterious that happens, a grace-filled moment when the priest puts his hands over the Eucharist and consecrates it. It becomes for us the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And this is articulated in John 6. It's articulated in the Last Supper accounts. It's articulated in 1 Corinthians 11. It's articulated by the people like St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was a disciple of John, St. Clement of Rome, who was a disciple of John and Peter. It's articulated in the earliest apologists like St. Justin Martyr, St. Irenaeus, and so on and so forth. And it's been articulated throughout the history of the Church that the Eucharist is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. And it was at this moment that I realized that this was what I was missing from church. This was why I was so frustrated, why I felt like Jesus was not at the center, because he wasn't at the center of these churches. The pastor was at the center of these churches. The music was at the center of these churches. But in the Catholic Mass, the Eucharist is the center of the church. It is the center. It is, as the Catechism says, it is the source and the summit of the Christian life. And so, friends, my journey began with a search for goodness. It continued with a search for truth. And then it culminated with the Eucharist and the discovery, the revelation of beauty. Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more, check out my podcast, Why Catholic? God bless you.